Um, you know, with this, with Prometeo, I feel as if I'm you are incredible already, but this sort of takes it to a whole other level. And what's kind of extraordinary about it is that I feel like I'm on a journey through your earlier work. There's a lot of resonance with your earlier work, and yet um, it's like it's all here, and yet it's also taking me and my heart and my head to a whole new place. That makes sense. Amazing, really incredible. And let me ask you, while I'm on this subject, did you conceive of it as an organic whole? Did the pieces come to you piecemeal and then you kind of selected them in? Because it feels very beautifully, like they all work so beautifully together.
I wish I could say that that's how it worked, but that's never how it's worked for any of my books. Um, I honestly never have any sense of a book until I'm almost 2/3 through writing the poems. Um, I actually have this kind of joke that if I knew what the book was going to be, I would then ruin all the poems. That I would know, and that I'd start like trying to tailor the poems, and it would be disastrous. I think part of the reason that a lot of my books feel coherent is that I'm a pretty obsessive compulsive person, and I tend to come back at things over and over, trying to understand them in different ways. And I think that actually is what holds a lot of the books together. I didn't actually appreciate how much Prometeo was in conversation with other books of mine until I actually got the very first copy. And this is going to sound idiotic, but when I actually sat down and read it, I was kind of surprised. I mean, I had only read it about a million times, but when I actually sat with it as a book and I started reading through it, I thought there's a lot of linkages between these poems and earlier poems. Um, and again, I guess that shouldn't be surprising to me because of what I just said, that I tend to come back to things and think about things. Um, I wrote the first of these poems in 2013. And I think I wrote the last of the poems in late 2018, almost 2019. And I think it was around 2017 that I had a sense of the book.
You publish with the same press all along here. And, one of my questions is, I suppose, why? And not in a kind of like, why, like, what are you doing? But like, really interesting that you've chosen to do that.
Well, part of it is a kind of technical or legal thing. My very first book was published by Northwestern University Press, and they did not have a right of first refusal. And when I approached them with the second book, they never rejected it, but it just kind of sat there. Part of that was that the editor that I had left the press, and there wasn't really a poetry editor at that time. There's a wonderful poetry editor at Northwestern now, but she came many, many years later. And so my book was picked up by a press called Zoo Press. And the second person was supposed to appear in 2015 at AWP in Vancouver. And I went to AWP, and it was pretty late in the year. And usually it's in February, but it was April, probably because Vancouver's colder. And I remember it was April 1st, and I thought it was an amazing April Fool's joke that there was no table from Zoo Press. The book never got published. There was a big scandal where the director of the press had taken all the money. And I just kind of thought, well, what am I supposed to do now? And I was teaching at Warren Wilson, and Martha Rhodes, the director of Four Way, who happens to be my editor too, said, you should send me the manuscript. And I was very, very, very leery of this because I know her. I mean, we were not very good friends at the time. And I said something about that, and she kind of laughed and said, darling, it's a business. I have lots of friends that I cannot publish. I have lots of people that, I publish that are not my friends. And she's like, it's not about friendship. She's like, I'm curious about your work. So I sent her the manuscript. She took it. And the contract had a first right of refusal. And every contract I've had since has had a first right of refusal, and they have not refused me. So, I mean, that's the basic answer, but there's actually another answer. I could break that contract. I know lots of poets who've done it. Friends of mine have done it. But I have to be honest, I find it hard to imagine that moving to another press is going to give me the same experience. Four Way is an incredible press. Everyone at the press knows the authors. From editorial with Martha Rhodes to copy editing with Sally Ball to working on the cover and the art design with Ryan Murphy to the publicist Clarissa Long telling you, okay, here are the options you have for readings. I'm going to set this one up. I have friends at other presses that they don't get anything like that. They don't get a lot of help with promoting the book. They don't get a lot of help setting up readings. They don't get a lot of help being entered for awards or prizes. It's like many of them talk about it as if the press prints their book. I could never say that. So, I mean, I feel so incredibly fortunate to have a press that is so supportive of me that I happily submit my next manuscript.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I'm loyal like a little puppy dog. Completely, totally get it. We were just talking, C-Dale, about a first poem written in 2013 and maybe the last one in 2018. And it is interesting to think about kind of your work in general. And I guess my question is, during this time you've been in San Francisco and even kind of beyond that period, has living in San Francisco for you, working in San Francisco, living in San Francisco, residency there, reinformed or infused your poetic with something else that you didn't have in your earlier work?
Well, I've actually been in San Francisco for more than 2 decades. So even my second book, a very large chunk of it was written in San Francisco. I think of the second person as my most San Francisco book. And the reason I think that is that a lot of places in San Francisco show up in the book, but places show up in books that have followed. And I think it's impossible to live somewhere and not have the environment affect how you write, because especially in poetry where you're using image, where do you think most images come from? I mean, the salty air here refracting the light, the kind of light that you have here, you don't see it elsewhere. And someone pointed out to me that I'm always obsessing in poems about shades of color and light. And I say, because I live in a place where that actually happens. If I were living in Miami Beach where it's really bright light and it's not that kind of gauzy, filmy light of San Francisco, it would be harder to discern color if you were looking at a shrub. It would just look green. You wouldn't see the different shades of green because of the quality of light. So, I think there's no way to escape where you live. I've always lived near the ocean, so I don't think it's surprising that the ocean and the sea and beaches show up in my work fairly often.
There was one poem in particular in this collection, the Mestizaje poem, that really struck me. There are other moments, of course, in Prometeo, but where language and identity, inheritance, the kind of claiming of that space or the courage to claim a space really struck me. And also there were moments in the collection where it seems like the poet's gaze is looking south of the border to Maya culture in Mexico, or the Caribbean with Taino. Maybe you can tell me a little bit about this kind of deep impulse, and it's certainly in some of the poems in this work.
Well, when I started out writing poems, when I was a graduate student, I talked about this actually with someone very recently. I would try to write poems about that came from my background. And, I have a very mixed background. I have Asian American lineage, I have Caribbean lineage, etc. And I was always kind of not discouraged, but it was one of the things that would come up was that you realize that once you put this out there, you've limited yourself, was the way it was presented to me. And I don't think that it was done in a nefarious way or a judgmental way, but I do feel that many of the previous generations of professors in creative writing programs, which are almost entirely white, I don't think they ever stopped to consider what it meant to write something universal. So they came at work that was different as, this is going to be a put off to readers, without considering the fact that there are many kinds of readers. And, in this discussion I was having, I told someone that I spent years under that kind of shroud. And at first I tried to come up with doing it my way. I started to think, well, if it's universal, what are the universal things? Okay, love, loss, death, grief. And the more I looked at it, the more I thought, I don't think that's really what they're saying. I think that what they're saying is that this work is strange. It comes from a different background, and therefore no one's going to want to read it. And the way I got around this and actually kind of learned the courage to actually, as strange as it sounds, become me as a poet was by reading outside of US culture. I'm much worse now, but I was much better at reading Spanish earlier, so I could read in the original. I can read Latin fairly well in the original. Most everything else I read in translation and asked people about what were good translations. But I very quickly realized something, and I joked about this not long ago, that a Russian writer can spend 30 pages of a novel writing about drinking tea, sweating, the heat, the smell of the tea, the room being fetid, blah, blah, blah. I can't imagine most people in the United States having a similar experience. So how is that universal? It is not universal. Or reading, work from Japan or Portugal or Brazil or Latin America, Mexico, etc. And so once I started to read that, and I thought, well, these people obviously never had teachers like mine. my work started to change, and I think it really started to change with my third book, Torn, where I joke it's my coming out book. It's not that I was ever hiding the fact that I'm gay in my previous books, but it's pretty hard to read Torn and not know this is a gay man writing this book. And with The Halo, I really wanted to give voice to a younger version of myself, but I still didn't feel comfortable being bold enough to just say it. So I kind of constructed this other narrative. And with Prometeo, I just felt like I've been doing this long enough and I should have the guts to write these poems. And there is an element of the book that is a little thumbing of the nose-ish. Like even a stanza in one of the poems mocks the English painter who looks at this beautiful seed and thinks it's gaudy. I don't think a younger version of me would have ever written something like that. Or, there are many moments that I just don't think I would have had. Courage is such a corny word, but I just don't think I would have had the wherewithal to write it.
A related question, and this comes up in the poem Amophila, where there's, of course, there's a paying homage to Walcott, and then the phrase landscapes are not only setting, they are the story, they are the worthwhile story. And this gets to kind of, a two-part question. One is kind of piggybacking on what we were just talking about, how you are still able to take us on this journey. And it's a journey, though, that is through landscape, through objects, through bodies, and not necessarily putting ideas, like hitting us over the head with ideas. And I see that, consistently through your work. And the second part of this question is kind of the lyric and the narrative function in your work. What I love about your poems is that, well, I'm on a journey with, the poet, and you take us on a journey, and you're not afraid to take us on that journey. At the same time, they're very formal. So yeah, I don't know if those are, where the question is there, but really maybe process how you're able to go from idea to kind of distill it down and then reconstruct it in and through landscape or image or object or image to take us to somewhere without kind of banging us on the head. And then secondly, how form and narrative function in your work.
Well, I guess the easiest way to start this answer is to say that I've probably been brainwashed by the Jesuits. My earliest learnings of poetics were not actually in a poetry class. It was in a philosophy class, required, of course, to graduate from a Jesuit college. And I distinctly remember the professor giving us a lecture on, I'm going to mess up the pronunciation, but I think it was called the enthymeme. And he said, this is a way of logic that comes from Aristotle's Poetics. And we spent a lot of time talking about the Poetics and this idea that something directly said doesn't have the same power as something that is deduced by an audience. And I still remember this. I mean, it had a very profound impact on me, and I wasn't even writing poems very seriously then. So I don't know why it had such an impact on me, but he would put on the board and say, Socrates, no, all men are mortal. This is the famous one. All men are mortal. Socrates is mortal. No, Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. And, we all kind of looked at it and we're like, well, duh. And then he said, okay, in one thing, we're giving a knowable fact. In another, we're giving another knowable fact, but they add up to something that might not be knowable. And he said, here is an example from, the modern era. All men are created equal. Black men are men. Black men, therefore, black men are equal. And I was stunned by this because he showed us slides of people marching for civil rights, holding up the sign, I am man. That's all the sign said. But it relied on the fact that people seeing the sign would know that all men are created equal. I am a man, therefore I am equal. And I was kind of blown away by that. I just thought, wow. And in my earliest poems, I had nothing to say. So I just kind of threw images and landscapes. I mean, when I was a painting student, I always painted landscapes. I was criticized for it, actually. And so I certainly have a proclivity for that. But I think once I went to graduate school and started learning how poems work, I found that for me, the most powerful poems were the ones where things didn't just happen, but you felt as if you were thinking in the poem, that you were like somehow an audience to the poet thinking. And the more I looked at that and broke it down, the more I realized that it was based in that Aristotelian rhetoric, in that poetics, this idea that if you can find something that plays off something, a reader can deduce something. It's an experience for the reader. It's not just me saying, well, you shouldn't shoot brown men. Yeah, you can write that, but that's probably better for an essay than a poem. So I think that's the first part of the answer is like, why do I think like that? I also think some of it stems from my process. I've said this in many interviews, and people often look at me like I'm completely nuts. But I always know the last line of the poem first. I have almost never written a poem where I didn't know how the poem ended, which sounds crazy, like I'm Cassandra, I'm a prophet or something. But often I know the last line of the poem long before I ever know the first line. I could go sometimes years. And once I have the first line, for me, the fun of writing is how do I get from A to Z? And I think it's because of that process of getting from A to Z why, someone has told me that they could always pick out a poem of mine because it had a kind of braided quality to it. I actually don't know that that's ever a goal. I think it's a result of doing that work of getting from A to Z, doing that thinking. A lot of it ends up in the poem.
Beautifully articulated. Thanks, Cedale. While we're on the topic of form, and then I want to take a little nugget that you had mentioned about the essay and talk about other forms that you work in. In an absolutely incredible way, have a powerful sense of just how kinetic a line break can be in a poem. And so I ask about your sense of that, but also generally form. Your poems are quite formal. So yeah.
Well, the funny part is I don't think of my poems as formal. This because we've had this discussion before. There are poems in this book that are written in pentameter, but oftentimes I wasn't fully aware of it until I was fairly into the poem. And I was like, this is like a pentameter line. And I go, the last 4 lines are pentameter lines. I'm like, okay, well, my brain's thinking pentameter. I'll just stick to it. So, I think like the poem The Point and um, the 3-part poem set in Playa del Carmen, they just ended up that way. But I will say that, and we've talked about this too, I am a structuralist. I believe in structure. And I think I believe in it even more now than I ever have. And part of it is that if you occupy your rational mind with structural things, the irrational mind finds a way to come to the surface, and you end up writing things that you would not normally write. So I find that if, I say to myself, okay, I need to get from A to Z, why don't I try tercets? And I start down that path, I'm not afraid to say, this isn't working, there's a poem in the book about Galileo that started out in tercets, and I was like, this is not working. This is not working at all. It's too clipped and contained. This needs a different kind of presentation. But in terms of specifically the line, I have a fair sense of my own line, but I never know it until I start revising the poem. And part of it is that I cannot revise the poem unless I read it out loud. And I told someone this recently, and they were laughing that I should make a video because they would love to see the look on my face. But I literally walk around my apartment, my house, reading it aloud. And every time I do it, I immediately go, oh, no, that line's wrong. No, bad tempo. I like to change tempo. I like the differences in tempo to match the differences in subject or content. And so, sometimes my line breaks might seem kind of odd to people, but if you read the poem out loud, it does not sound odd. If I'm in a moment where I'm being very intense, I might go for something more staccato in rhythm where the line break seems odd, but when you read it, it has a certain tempo that it does not have if I had broken the line a different way. I think one of the hard things is that a lot of people that read poetry today, they're much more interested in poems on the page. And at the same time, there's a huge segment of the population that love to hear poems being performed. But often those two groups of people don't interact. They don't realize that actually both things have always been essential. The oral or the listening part of it is actually older than the page. It's the primal part of poetry. But yeah, I think that in terms of line, I'm always deeply aware of sound. And yeah, I think if you're writing iambic pentameter, it's really easy. I know people would laugh at hearing that, but you know where your line ends because you do your 5 feet. You might add an extra syllable for a feminine ending so you don't sound ti-tum, ti-tum, ti-tum. I don't know. I find that almost so easy, it's ridiculous. But I also know that I'm probably at the tail end of a series of generations that even hear pentameter. I'm amazed how many times someone will say, I love the rhythm of this poem. It seems so unique. And I'm like, well, it's iambic pentameter. It's been used for centuries. I did not invent it. Shakespeare really used it a lot. But I think it's that since it's no longer the dominant sound in poetry, I think it's hard, especially for younger poets and younger readers, to hear it. They don't hear it. It's kind of weird.
Yeah, same here. I can say I'm on the same page as you. See, Dale, you also work in other forms beautifully. I should add, of course, the essay, and then of course with the affliction, you have your novel and short stories. Tell tell our audience, our readers, like a little bit about that the decisions there. Is it kind of I wake up and it's not a poem in me today, it's a short story, or is it not that clear cut?
I wish it were that clear cut. Um, the affliction, many of the chapters of the affliction, the stories in the affliction, were written in the exact same period of time I was writing the Halo. And, you know, it wasn't until the Halo was published and the affliction was coming out that I suddenly had this moment where I was like, I think I'm trying to work in larger forms, but I don't know how to. So I've concocted ways of making larger forms. And the reason I thought that was, someone joked they thought the Halo was a novel in poems. I actually don't. I think that's a horrible designation, but I can see where that comes from. And The Affliction is clearly a novel in stories. And I've been working on a novel. I'm on working on the fourth draft of a full-scale novel. It's completely overbloated. I think it's currently about 128,000 words. It needs to lose about 30,000 words. So I've been pruning like a madman, and really questioning every sentence, like, is this necessary? But it's very different work. But to go back to your question, like, do I just wake up and say, okay, now I'm going to write a story? No. In fact, I tried writing the work of The Affliction many times as poems, and they never worked. Some of that work is actually in Prometeo, but I couldn't make it work. But I was so stubborn that I just kept trying, and I tried for years. And I went to do a reading and a colloquium at Oregon State. And for whatever reason, most of the people that came to the colloquium were fiction writers. There were very few poets that came. There was a mix-up with the scheduling, shocking, at a university, where I think one of the poetry workshops was actually going on during my colloquium. So it was mostly fiction writers, and they kept joking that they couldn't believe I didn't write fiction. And I said, why is that? And they said, well, whenever you tell stories, you tell them the way a fiction writer does, like just talking. And I laughed. I said, yeah, no, I don't write fiction. That's too much butt in the seat for me. And, but when I left there 2 days later on the van ride back to the airport, I had the sentence that came into my head. It's actually the opening sentence of The Affliction. I think it was, no one would have believed Ricardo Blanco if he had told them that he had seen Javier Castillo disappear. And I thought, that doesn't sound like a poem. That doesn't sound like the end of a poem. How would I start that poem? And I wrote it down as a joke. And I actually remember saying, oh, maybe it's the start of a short story. And it kept nagging at me. I kept wanting to know more, and I kept adding sentences. And within a week or two, I had the first draft of what is the opening chapter of The Affliction. And part of me wishes I had figured that out years earlier, because it was satisfying in a completely different way. Unlike poems, I have no idea how stories end. I have no idea where they're going. The characters kind of take over. They kind of drive the narrative. They say things that you think, I would never say something like that. And some of them say things and you think, oh, I would definitely say that. So I don't know. It's a different experience. The essay is the one, strangely enough, that I find the most difficult. Despite the fact I just told you that I love to think in poems and recreate the sensation of thinking in poems. And I have a few published essays, but I find that they take an extraordinary amount of work, and I often don't feel satisfied. I don't know that I've ever published an essay that I thought, I feel really good about this. I always feel like it's okay. But I don't know, maybe that's just the form. Maybe that's how one feels when you publish an essay. I don't know, you write more essays than I do.
Yeah, I think you're right. That, well, I just, there, it's done, and it's not something that I go back to like in my fiction or something to kind of tweak. It's like I write it and I'm done, and it's out in the world, and but let me ask you, so you have, and this is, gets kind of to the core of some of the of this interview, which is 4 interventions, this feature that I have with American Book Review. And the question, I guess, is, and I know we get this all the time, but I'm really curious, because you are an MD and you're a poet and you're a fiction author and an essayist. Does fiction, does poetry intervene in the world? Like, I know, yeah, does it? And how, I guess, if it does?
I think it does and it doesn't. I think it depends on how you define intervene. That ends up being the core of the question. If you think of intervening as something physical, like Auden saying that poetry doesn't change the world. If you're expecting poetry or fiction to have a direct impact on policy or how people vote or something like that, I just don't think so. The best literature inhabits a space of mystery and questioning. It is not a place of certainty, and that's actually its power. Can it change people? Can it intervene? I think so. I know it has for me and many people that I know that love to read. Most writers are readers first that love to read so much that eventually the only way you can participate more is to actually help make the stuff that people read. But because literature, poetry, fiction likes to dwell in places of mystery and uncertainty, it allows a reader to occupy a different way of thinking, almost like it offers a chance for someone to step into somebody else's shoes. Look at how many people, it's a problematic book for other reasons, but look at how many people were affected by To Kill a Mockingbird. Many of the people that read that book are white, American, Southern, and suddenly they were faced with a kind of injustice that they might not have ever thought about in that way. Or, George Orwell writing his essay, A Hanging, where the man being led to the gallows steps around the puddle while the dogs run through the puddle. And you're suddenly faced with, my God, that's a thinking human being. It's not an animal to be put to death. So can literature change things? Probably not. Can it change people? I think it can. I think at the core, all literature allows us to be more empathetic. It allows us to consider things in a way that we might not think of them. And I do think one of the worst aspects of the past 40 to 50 years is this sudden reliance or belief that what one studies in college should equal a job. I don't know. I had many classmates when I was in college who have degrees in English. One is the communication director of Mobil Oil. Another is a rare books librarian at Christie's. Another one works in the tech world. Why should what you study in college be so tied? And I think it's because of the cost of college, and education has become so completely outrageous. I don't think it was not outrageous before, but it's really become outrageous. that parents now feel like, well, if I'm going to spend $70,000, a year, or $50,000 a year, or whatever, like, you need a good job. Like, and as a result, we have a lot of people now that have not studied the humanities. They cannot read critically. They cannot think critically. And I'm not saying that to perpetuate some kind of liberal elite ideal, but people don't question. And part of the reason they don't question is they haven't been in a course of study, even if it's an elective, where they've been taught to question. I keep hearing that many universities keep eliminating the requirement of English. That if students take courses that have enough essays, that they don't have to take English. I think that's appalling. I hear schools where people don't have to study history. How can you be an adult and not study history? Isn't that important? And so, I don't know, I'm probably way off field at this point, but, I do think that literature, the reading of literature, the study of literature, the study of history, the study of the humanities, there's a reason it's called the humanities. It's a way to understand the human animal.
Cedel, you also teach future generations of poets, and I'm wondering here, or in a related question, what, I know, I'm sure, I know amazing things go on in your classroom, but is there a kind of trademark? Is there something that, you bring beyond just kind of, formal workshopping, et cetera, to those spaces for students?
Well, I teach at Warren Wilson, where the core of the program is not the workshop model at all. You meet twice a year for 10 days, and there are workshops, but the real reason for workshops in our model is to allow students, to learn how to verbalize their thinking, how to be a good critic. Students get far more in-depth and personal feedback on their work during the semester, where they're working one-on-one with someone. I think I'm kind of probably notorious for certain phrases and certain ideas. So one of the things that I say often, and students crack up, is I always say, this violates the laws of physics. I'm like, either the entire poem has to completely destroy our sense of the natural world, or this doesn't make sense. And the example that I love to give is someone will write a poem where they're remembering their teenage years and they got high and they're lying on the bed and it's a dark room, but somehow the speaker sees the fan cutting the shadow on the ceiling. And I say, how is that possible? There's no light in the room. What is casting the shadow? You're being high? I'm like, either you have to make this poem like cuckoo so we know that you're high, or you have to obey the laws of physics. And so, I know that in workshops sometimes, even when I'm not there, students have said, this violates Seedale's laws of physics. And I find that hilarious because they're not my laws. But I'm the one who usually raises them, like, what is this? The other thing I think what I'm probably known for is I have this expression that I use where I say, every time you introduce another person into a poem, you, the poet, have more work to do so that the reader knows who these people are in relation to each other. It's not that you have to define them. And I always say to them, have you ever wondered why so many poems have just the speaker in them? They're the easiest poem to write. And so they call it the number rule. So they start counting and they'll say, well, this poem has like 5 people in it. And CDL would say that there's not enough poem here for us to know who these 5 people are. So, I mean, I don't know, they're quirky things, but there are truths behind them. Every time you add a person, you run the risk of the reader not knowing who's doing what to whom. and what's happening in the poem. And poems are short to begin with. They're very dense often. They're very concise. There's a big difference between writing a short story that has 25 characters and writing a poem of 30 lines with 20 people. One is pushing it. One is complete madness. And I think the other thing I'm probably known for, and I think every student that's been in a seminar with me will tell you this, is that I rarely state things directly. I tend to ask questions, not a surprise, Aristotle, and I try to bring people to make the statement that I want them to make. And I think that why I do that is because, one, some of my former teachers, but two, I really do think that when a student articulates something or comes to something, they keep it. I can tell them something 10 times, they'll never remember it. I can be like, there's a difference between image and detail. Here's why they're different. And they go, okay. And then 2 weeks later, they're like, I thought this was an image. No, it's not. But if I get them to come to that point, they never forget it, because it's come from within. I didn't just preach it at them like a sermon.
Completely. I love it. I've just learned so much right now, Dale. Thank you. Especially for flash fiction. I think that's a really useful kind of thing to have up on my wall when I'm writing that, more characters, make sure I'm not losing people here, because, it's got the same constraints in many ways as a...
Yeah, you almost have to double the size of the work every time you add a character. It's really... And I've tried to subvert this myself. And the reason I believe this is that no matter how I try, it's almost impossible. Like, if you can get away with a 5-line poem with one speaker, but once you put another person in there, then you're like, okay, all that can happen is a basic transaction. Jack hit Jill. Lots of image, some modifying phrases. After the supper, under the counter, as they lay there looking at the pipes, Jack hit Jill, but the basic thing is just an action. But once you start adding a third person, you can't get away with 5 lines.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's like, well, who's doing what to whom? Is the person watching Jack hit Jill? Is the person next to them? Where are they? How do you define that? This is why, so many poets, I always joke, I just read their poems. I'm like, you need to go write a short story. Like, you want to tell this elaborate story that can't be told in this poem. And they're usually offended, but eventually they try it out, or they find a different way. Maybe they write the poem in sections and devote different sections to different people.
Dale, are there poets today, or even yesterday, or both, that you find yourself really gravitating toward again and again?
It hasn't changed. There are a handful of poets that I return to fairly obsessively. One always sounds so completely fuddy-duddy and ridiculous that I'm almost embarrassed to say, but I think people know. I read Donne's Holy Sonnets all the time. I still cannot get over the fact that even with the bizarre, archaic sounding language, how incredibly modern Donne sounds. If you look at other people writing at that time period, they sound alien. Donne does not sound alien. He sounds manic and strange in a way that a postmodern writer sounds, and the things that he says, even though they're addressed to God, they're sometimes shocking. I often ask students to read Donne, and they often look at me like, oh God. And they usually come back with the same response that, like, this was easier to read than I thought it was going to be. And also, it was far more interesting than I thought it was going to be. So Donne is someone that I return to fairly often. Another poet that I return to very often is Yeats, which is very odd. I mean, I suspect it has to do with the first time I had to recite a poem was a poem by Yeats, and I was completely destroyed by it. I just couldn't believe something like that existed in the world. And so I think Yeats has like a strange space in my heart. I don't love all of Yeats's poems. Some of his poems, many of the poems in Michael Robarts and The Dancer, you know, they're amazing. The Easter poem, things like that. They're, you know, The Second Coming. They're powerful poems. I also find it interesting because often I hear people say things like, there's no such thing as political poetry. And I laugh because I think all poetry is political. All writing makes you choose what you're going to have to say, which is a political act. And why anyone believes they have the right to say and write is itself a political act. But I also find it interesting because I think Yeats is one of the most taught and known political poets that over time has been watered down into like the Nobel laureate, the great Irish poet. This man was angry as hell about everything, and especially about what was going on, you know, with the government of his country. And then the other poet that I return to fairly often is the poet where I learned about lyric and narrative, which is the poet Seamus Heaney, also Irish. I have no Irish blood, I should point out. I have English blood, but I don't know that either Yeats or Heaney would love that. But Heaney had a phrase that there's no such thing as lyric versus narrative. The best poems subvert both. And he liked to point out, looking actually at other poets like Derek Walcott, that often there's a narrative threading under the surface. There's all this beautiful visual stuff, but there is a narrative. And I think that I've always bought into that it's not that every poem I write has a narrative, but like that impulse to tell, not just to see, is very strong for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's what grabbed me at the very beginning when I started reading your work, and it continues to deeply engage me today. See, Dale, we're living in a pandemic, through a pandemic. You're on, many ways the kind of front lines to this as an MD. There have been a lot of attempts at creating stories, fictions, TV shows, fiction itself, alphabetic. Cortázar, and then in a different way, Toni Morrison talk also, though, about needing a certain distance on our present kind of proximate experiences to be able to really see all of the ways that we can recreate that. And I wonder, how you're seeing this as a creator. Yeah.
Well, I would agree. I think there is a difference between literature and journalism. And I don't mean that as a slight to journalism. I'm not saying that literature is somehow pristine and elevated, but I feel like the job of literature is to look at something in as many ways as possible and synthesize. It's all of those different perspectives that allow literature to see things in a different way and to see it more fully. We had a version of this after 9/11 where I think within weeks there was a poem, I don't remember whose poem it was, in the New Yorker about 9/11. And then there was a poem in the New York Times and another one in the Atlantic. And I was doing an interview, this is many, many years ago, and someone said to me, do you think that these poems are, necessary? And I said, well, I'm sure they're necessary, but I don't think they're the best poems. And of course, in poetry, you're not supposed to say things like that. And so, the interviewer kind of latched on and kind of took me over the coals for this. But I stood my ground and I said, the best poems about 9/11 will be written and published about 5 to 6 years after 9/11. I said, right now, all we're writing is propaganda. I said, it's one-sided, it's emotionally driven. It doesn't see perspectives of things other than our very, very limited perspective. So I was quoted as, political poetry is propaganda, which is actually not what I believe at all. I just don't think political poetry is that simplistic. So, I think, yes, I am sure there are things being written about the pandemic, but, this isn't the first pandemic. I mean, Ellen Bryant Voigt's Kyrie is about a pandemic, the flu pandemic, the Spanish flu. There are many fictional, novels, short stories about disease, pandemics, love in the time of cholera. So I think some of that is already there in the ether before the pandemic even arrived. There will be people who will try to now say, oh my God, I'm locked up. I have to turn this into art. And maybe by the time they finish all the revisions, they'll see that it needs a lot more. Who knows? We all have different impulses, but a lot depends on the writer's skill. Despite the fact Toni Morrison said that, I have a feeling that Toni Morrison could start writing about the pandemic right now, and it would be this amazing novel. It would open, no one thought they would die. Kind of classic, they shot the white woman first. She has these ways of starting her novels are kind of like, bang, you're in it. There's no way out now. And she'd probably write an amazing novel despite her saying that. But I do understand why she and someone like Cortázar would say that, because I think both of them understood an element of journalism and the need to do something more to fill out and make something literary.
Beautiful, beautifully stated, C. Dale. What you mentioned as we wrap this up, that you're working hard to pare down a very big novel that you've written. What else do you see coming down the pipeline, or what else are you working on that you could share with us? Or maybe we could talk more about this novel.
I've been writing some poems, so I'm still writing poems here and there. I have no idea. I'm at the early end, so I have no idea what that is yet. The novel is kind of a funny thing. After I wrote The Affliction, I had lived with those characters for so long that I wanted to write one more story. That was how it started. I wanted to write one more story. I was like, I'm going to write one more story about Cassie. And, I started writing the story. And then when I hit about page 50, I was like, this is not a story. I'm like, okay, maybe it's a novella. Then when I hit about page 150, I was like, this is not a novella. And I kind of stopped, looked at what I had, and I thought, this is a novel. And I started to think about how families inherit the sins of their forebears. And the more I thought about this and how some of that actually already exists in The Affliction, I decided to go back one generation, and then I started moving forward. So it's a prequel to The Affliction. It starts 2 generations back and ends with the birth of Javier Castillo, which we know from The Affliction. But, you have to make certain choices. So The Affliction's written from a third-person standpoint, which makes it not entirely reliable. And I found that to do this novel, I had to take the old-fashioned, all-knowing narrator, the omnipotent narrator. But yeah, I, the thing is, like, I love the work. I love the work of the writing. So having a draft that I can just go to at any point for an hour and prune and think and change sentences and cut things, etc. It's a lot more like poetry to me than getting the draft of the novel down, which is always like, I don't know if I'm going to finish. I'm going to lose my train of thought. That's how I always feel. And I don't know that's ever going to change. But I don't know. I love having that work. I tell my students all the time that you have to love the work. If you go into this with the idea that publication or awards or acclaim are going to be like a goal, you'll be destroyed. Even people I knew who came out the gate and won big awards, when they couldn't keep winning awards, they disappeared. They stopped writing. You have to love the work. If you don't love the work, you're not going to survive. You won't survive to write book after book.
Wow, C. Dale, it has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for gifting me and the readers eventually of this interview. Really amazing as always, and I'm always like just blown away with your work and where it takes me. And thank you so much.
Well, thank you for asking me to chat with you. I think, many of us rely on people like you to make us think about what we do. So thank you. It was a pleasure.